That joke isn't funny anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and I'm very happy to be joined by my next guest. His name is Malcolm Clark. He's a TV science documentary producer, and he also has a Substack that you should check out, Malcolm Richard Clark. So he went with the three names there. So Malcolm, thank you so much for joining me. It's been fun getting to know you over the process of actually getting you on this official recording. Something that we did, and I've done it before. Is we had a sort of a pre-chat, sort of to feel each other out, or more on your end, to feel out this guy. He's like, who's this? Some
wild extremist.
Yeah, wild extremist from the States. Coming in and wanting to talk to him. But it seems like in your line of work that it's a good precaution to take.
Yeah. I mean, whenever we're doing interviews, obviously, the last thing you want to do is turn up at someone's house and interview them and then discover that they're going to say something really cranky. So, and the downside is, of course, that you can sometimes talk so much that then you don't want to say the same stories again with the same freshness. Mm-hmm. But hopefully I won't sound bored by my own points.
No, I mean, I think the stuff that you cover is just so out there to begin with, that I think a lot of the stuff that we were talking about, I think it needs like a second or third telling just to really sink in. But something that I've been thinking about recently is I've read a few books by the Dr. Oliver Sacks, who's no longer with us, and here we had I believe a neurologist who he not only treated patients but also had this career in pop culture by writing books about these really interesting cases about people with brain abnormalities and all of that. And one of the stories that I'm rereading is the one with the man who mistook his wife for a hat. For a hat. And as a comedian, I'm looking at it as how can I might be able to use this material. The idea of, I wonder how often that excuse worked on his wife. Like, it's like, no, honey, I'm sorry, I have this weird brain thing. That's why I forget all of this stuff.
All the things that you could mistake your wife for.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it? Usually, I mistook another woman for my wife. Isn't that the normal excuse?
That's obviously going to be the next step in the comedic progression there. But I bring that up because I think a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about has to do with psychology and psychiatry and that sort of thing. So maybe I don't know where you want to open up, start off.
Yeah, I suppose it's worth starting. How did I get into this whole strange debate about people being born in the wrong body? Yeah. And I suppose I think what's beginning to happen is, even in America, but certainly over here in Britain, is that a lot of people are beginning to realize that this movement, this gender identity movement, which presented itself as a social justice movement, they've now looked at it again and realized that actually there's a lot of mental health conditions that are smuggled in under this rubric of social justice. And I think people are beginning to look at it more carefully and beginning to see pathologies, if you like. And obviously nobody wants to suggest that everybody who considers themselves transgender or non-binary is pathological. But I do think that we've lost sight of the fact that the notion of being born in the wrong body is fundamentally a mental health condition. I mean, it's not that far from mistaking your wife for a hat. I mean, 20 years ago, even, maybe less, if you told people you thought you were in somebody else's body or somebody else was inside your body, you'd immediately hear the music, from the Twilight Zone. You'd
Mhm.
think, uh-oh, something creepy here. But somehow, after 20 years of all being told that this is actually just some quite common condition, and these people who think they're born in the wrong body are all to be pitied, and their rights aren't acknowledged, and we have to change the whole of society to fit round this tiny minority. I think we're all beginning to realize, no, wait a minute. Let's put the brakes on here. Let's reconsider. Let's look at the history, which is what I've been doing over the last 2 years, is looking at the history, where it all comes from, how it evolved, and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, and with that history, where did it start? Where did it come from? Because
I mean,
it's fairly
yeah.
it's a fairly new thing. It seems like.
Well, I mean, I think believe it or not, in the 19th century, a few key figures, one in Germany, one in England, were trying to work out what homosexuality might be. And they came up with these kind of weird ideas that there might be a third sex or a third gender. And they thought that sort of effeminate guys and very masculine women were somehow maybe, a third sex. But we're talking about a culture in the 19th century which was so, enforced such rigid stereotypes of what it was to be a man or a woman. So even if a woman wanted to not ride a horse side saddle, that was considered, that's very masculine. I mean, if a woman expressed her opinion, that was considered masculine.
Wit. Wit was a masculine thing too.
Yeah. And so that was a very different world. Those ideas were then taken up in Germany in the 1920s by a guy, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a very famous sexologist, probably the first big sexologist, who happened to be Jewish. And so the Nazis, when they came to power, absolutely hated him. And I think that helped give his clinic and the work that he did a sort of aura of being progressive, because the Nazis hated him. But actually, once you look at his work, it was full of some of this ridiculous ideas, which we're now, are dominating our culture. But he had the idea of a gender spectrum, and there was like 500 different bits in the gender spectrum. He was himself a eugenicist. He believed that anyone who was homosexual should not reproduce, even though he was himself gay. But more to the point, he was the guy who really pioneered sex change surgery, or what we would now are forced to call gender affirmation healthcare, or whatever that means. But basically, sex change operations. He was the first guy to work with surgeons to try to. It was only at that stage men into women, and the first two operations that he organized. One of them was a slightly simple guy who was convinced that he was a woman, and they did it. And that was the very first time that a guy had what's called a vaginoplasty, and they created a neo-vagina for Dora Richter, as he changed his name to. But the other person who came, I think, second was the person that was the subject of the movie, The Danish Girl. And this was a Danish Danish artist, who became convinced that he was really a woman. But he was very mentally unstable, and he published a diary, or his diary was published after his death. And I mean, it's not often read now. I managed to get myself a copy. I think it's called Man to Woman. And this guy was nuts. I mean, he believed that he menstruated through his nose, and this proved, and his nosebleeds were one of his proofs that he was a woman. There you go. Don't have a nosebleed, otherwise you might find yourself getting gender reassignment.
Yeah, I've always felt a little bit more feminine every time someone punched me in the nose, and
yeah, exactly. Anyway, so he had the operation. Hirschfeld organized it. The surgeon, both the first case, Dora Richter, and then Lily Elber, as he became known. The second case, the operation was done by Erwin Gohrbandt, who would then become a prominent Nazi, and would run. Hitler was obsessed with, or the Nazis were obsessed with, sterilizing the disabled because they wanted to keep their race pure by getting rid of everybody who was disabled. I mean, we do consider it, a huge war crime. But the person who ran that in Berlin was the person who did the first vaginoplasties. And so this idea that, that the transgender movement, if you like, is entirely progressive or even has progressive roots is absolute nonsense. You go back there and it's a mixture of crackpot ideas, experimental and dangerous surgery, and some deeply unattractive views politically and socially.
Yeah. I wonder, looking at that, the time period, it's almost like, we're coming out of a time of, more farming and that sort of thing, and industrialization, and freeing up, people are finally getting like free time to read, to pursue education and all that. And I wonder is there an element to that where I'm not just saying like, man, we have a lot of free time. That's why people are thinking that they're
we castrate
not the right
each other.
sex. Yeah. But
I don't know. I think it might well have been that a lot of the thing that we forget is that right up until the 1920s, male and female behavior was so heavily policed. I mean, women didn't have the vote in most countries. They didn't have rights. Men, there were very strict rules about how men behaved. And I think perhaps the policing of gender roles was so pathologically, fixed that it created its own nuttiness as a reaction. If you did not fit into a very macho stereotype or a very feminine stereotype, then I think you would have a lot of problems and you were quite troubled. And now looking back, it's hard to imagine what the solution would have been, but the transsexual answer wasn't the right one.
Mm-hmm. And at that time too, like, the early, 1900s, what you're talking about, like crackpot theories. I mean, that's the time of, phrenology.
Yes.
And, you brought up sterilization. There was a TV series called The Nick, and it was about the Knickerbocker Hospital, which I think was like the first hospital in New York City. And there's there's a part of it, not necessarily a storyline, but you have these orphaned boys who have come over, on the boat from wherever, and they make one of their first visits to the doctor, and the doctor is performing vasectomies. And of course, the boys don't know what's going on, but the viewer, we know what's going on. And that was, I guess, at that time, is a norm. Here you have these, these street kids. You gotta, basically, sterilize them so they don't go on. So you have like a lot of these, crackpot theories, and sort of turning to science as like a way of fixing this stuff. So even the idea of like the first person to make that leap and say, you know what, we can turn that penis into a vagina, even like, it's like we can fix what nature got wrong here.
Well, there was a huge, it was only around about, I think 1910, maybe slightly earlier, when really hormones had just really become available properly. You could synthesize and you could make what we call the male hormones, female hormones. That's not really a very accurate description of them, but testosterone and estrogen. And so scientists felt suddenly they had all this power where they could give guys testosterone or they could give women estrogen and vice versa. And I suppose whenever some huge new breakthrough happens, scientists think they're on the cusp of, complete power, the power of God. And you'd really get the sense, and of course the sex change surgery depended on you, first of all, having cross-sex hormones for a period. And there was a real sense that the doctors now had the power to do things that they hadn't done before. I know that, the difference is that, we have a much more scientifically, believe it or not, a much more scientifically literate public than there was at the turn of the century or right up until World War II. And there weren't a lot of questions made of claims. And so various crackpot doctors, one of whom Hirschfeld worked with, Eugen Steinach, he developed this very similar to the vasectomy. He did vasectomies, but he also implanted little tiny bits of testicle gland. Don't ask me how he got the testicle glands. And one of the things I read, it was donated, and I thought, who donates their testicles?
Leave that in my will.
Yeah, exactly. But it became a huge thing, and various figures. Freud wanted it. Einstein got it. All these people wanted this little bit of, because Steinach argued that it would boost your energy, make you feel younger, and improve your libido. So, surprise, surprise, hundreds of men queued up to get the Steinach. There's absolutely no evidence it worked. In fact, it could not have worked. But there wasn't a sort of critical public or journalists that were able to really push up against all these quack cures. And the transsexual thing is, in a way, just another of these quack cures for a problem. But it's taken root and hasn't really been challenged properly.
With the testicular gland, is that how was it taken? Was it like a?
It was, as I understand, it was a tiny sliver of gland that was put under the skin, and apparently, you see, it would then infuse its sort of hormones through your body. But we know that doesn't work. It couldn't possibly work, but they didn't know that then.
Yeah, I'm just looking back to when I was a kid playing ice hockey, and me and my teammates would fuck around, after a game or hotels and stuff, and the idea like someone's asleep and you put your balls on their head, and like somehow maybe if we went back to the 1920s, maybe there's a quack doctor who's like, yeah, if you have a night of sleep with testicles on your forehead,
it was as likely to work.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds like it might be more fun than getting a gland inserted in your skin.
Yeah, a lot funnier too. For sure. If you at least doing it for doing it for the laughs.
Yeah.
That's so wild. On the surgery. On the surgery tip too. Something that I've been thinking about, in particular, and this is thanks to Twitter, I've been confronted with a lot more images of double mastectomies or top surgery on young girls who identify as males, and the surgery itself, it looks so violent, and it's almost it looks primitive, like the scarring that it leaves behind. It's very hard to look at. So there's that element that I'm confronted with, but then I'm also confronted with why is it that we just can't normalize these trans men having breasts? Like say it's okay, you could have breasts, or you're a trans woman, it's okay, you can keep your your balls, your bollocks, you keep them, and keep your unit and live your life. The idea that you need to get rid of these bodily parts in order to fit into whatever category you are, that's something I have a tough time.
It's a difficult one because some of these girls do want to remove their breasts. And, especially in America, it's less so over here because we have a national health service. And so everything has to go through a filter of cash-strapped hospitals.
Right.
But in America, it's a culture where anybody who wants to do something should be enabled to do it. And I think that's one problem where we forget that the choices that people make are sometimes deeply influenced by the culture around us, peer pressure, social media, and they think they're taking a decision that is the authentic their decision. they're not factoring in that these other pressures are sort of impacting them. But I mean, maybe there will always be there may be a tiny minority of girls who would rather not have breasts. The problem is, once you normalize it, and once you start, what the transgender movement did is start to talk about it as liberating and being your authentic self, and then celebrating it online. Oh my God, I've had my breast removed. Well, I mean, that inevitably will affect loads of vulnerable girls who have other comorbidities or other psychological problems. You know, we've always known that loads of girls going through puberty, you know, cut themselves, have anorexia, have bulimia, lots of body issues. And I think the big question is, you know, why do girls go through that? Because boys don't tend to go through it the same. And it may well be that if you're an adolescent girl, you know, I don't think we prepare adolescent girls enough for the, you know, stress and the changes of puberty. You know, it's not such a big change for a guy to get a bit hairier and a bit greasier and you know, start filling out. It's a huge difference for a girl. I mean, periods.
Right. Their nose bleeds every month.
Yes,
like the
according
Danish
to Lily
fella.
Elba anyway. Yeah. It's an enormous change for a girl, and then of course you have male attention suddenly, and so you know, and it can be quite fierce. And if you are the sort of girl, not necessarily lesbian, but maybe just not that into, you know, some girls love the attention. You know, hey, I'm an adult. A lot of girls don't, and so that creates psychological issues. And then the trans movement comes along, drops in front of these girls an ideal solution. You know, all of that horrible feeling, all that stuff, and probably your periods and your breath. You know, we're going to get rid of all that, and you're going to feel the way you did before you went through puberty. Well, I mean, no wonder a lot of girls are grabbing onto it.
Yeah.
And they're opting out of all that, I mean, sexual harassment, if you like. That if they're lesbian, then they don't really have to address the lesbianism, because, you know, there's still out there vestiges of homophobia. And so a lot of these lesbian girls or bisexual girls or whatever, they don't want to be bisexual or lesbian. But if they are trans, then they're not. They're just boys. And they fancy girls, and they're straight. Well, no, you're a biological female, and you're attracted to other biological females. You're homosexual. But it's not all of these girls, but a large proportion, who knows, maybe half of them or whatever, are sort of opting out of. They've already got the physical discomfort of going through puberty, but they're also opting out of any psychological difficulty by not identifying as homosexual.
Yeah, it's super complicated. Recently I tweeted, I said the best thing I ever went through in life is puberty. And you know,
me too.
I you know, as awkward as it was, like, my God, thank goodness I went through it, because it and you know, to be a guy talking about it, you know, the sexual gratification of, you know, self-harm, you know, it was you know, the highlight of my life, definitely in the early days.
It's been downhill ever since, has it?
Yeah, it's just not the same. But so yeah, sometimes I still feel like a horny teenager sometimes, if I'm fortunate enough. But you know, like with that, you know, because we are talking about, you know, younger people going through this, the idea of, you know, puberty blockers to begin with. It's so batshit crazy, and I think you guys in the UK and also in Europe have done, it seems like, a better job of halting that. Whereas in the United States, I still see people pushing it. The idea of like, oh yeah, we're just going to stop kids from having puberty, and everything will be okay, and they'll be fine. Yeah.
No, I mean, I was particularly drawn to the stuff about puberty blockers because I did development for a show, and it didn't in the end come off. But as a science documentary maker, I did a lot of research around about 10 years ago, and it was going to be about adolescence, because there's so much has been discovered really only very recently. I mean, comparatively recently, probably in the last 10, 12, maybe 15 years. They started doing brain scans, like the proper fMRI scans of the teenage brain. And they were amazed, because everybody just thought that the brain got sort of bigger and bigger as or more neurons as you not bigger physically, but more neurons as you got older. When they started doing the scans, they were like, what the shit is going on here? Because it's a whole new process, which has been described as the most radical transformation of your brain that you'll go through in your life. Basically, it's all rewired, and so neural connections, they're cut, they're added. The myelin layer, which is a sort of white layer around the brain, it's radically transformed. And they suddenly realized that it explains so much of adolescent behavior. I mean, we all know that they sleep at funny times, they behave in a really shy, sort of self-conscious way. They're sort of they're really keen to bond with their peers. They really care what their peers think of them. It's basically a whole bunch of different things. They don't want to be with mum and dad anymore. Right. Get off. All that stuff. These are all behavior patterns that are almost universal in adolescence in every species, every country. And they suddenly realized it was all to do with this pruning that goes on in the brain. Now, the reason that matters is all the work that was done on puberty blockers was done in the early 90s, before they did these fMRI scans. And so they never considered the impact on brain development. They kind of knew that if you block the puberty, then secondary sex characteristics, i.e. breasts, hair in guys, the genitals in kids, they wouldn't develop because you're stopping the puberty. They didn't give a second thought to the brain development. And if your brain is being radically rewired, causing huge changes in the way that you socialize as a teenager, and you stop that, then it is very hard to imagine that, and most of these kids never, don't go off the puberty blockers and have a normal puberty. They go straight to cross-sex hormones. But even if you did stop the puberty blockers after 3 or 4 years, you have missed the opportunity as a teenager to do all the bonding and the socializing and hanging with your peers that you would have done as you go through puberty. And so what you end up with is these very isolated kids who are often already a little bit autistic or on the spectrum. You stop their puberty, which would at least have, maybe a lot of them driven them to bond with their, friends. And they become even more isolated. They become even more uncertain, and they become even more vulnerable.
So have they been following, these kids for, the past, decade or more, like checking in on them? And
that's the ridiculous thing is, of course, that the Tavistock, which is the big gender identity clinic for kids, the gender identity development service in London, which is now about to be closed because the science that we're doing was so bad. They didn't do that when they did their puberty blocker trial. They didn't do any follow-up, and in most places they don't do proper follow-up. And it's now, because it's argued by the trans movement that you have to give them these blockers, otherwise they might commit suicide. No one will agree to do. I mean, what we should have done 20 years ago, if you were going to be interested in introducing puberty blockers would have been to do two groups of people, two groups of similarly gender dysphoric kids. Some get puberty blockers, some don't, and let's see what happens. Now the other side, the trans lobby, says you can't do that because we know they're so life-saving that it would be unethical not to give them to a group of kids. So there is no way to run these trials now. But no, the simple answer, the follow-up was terrible. I mean, other people have now gone back to the few cases that there was some follow-up, and they've gone back and they've tried to, locate kids who had the puberty blockers. Among the first group in Holland, the very first trial, what they tended to do is they would give the puberty blockers and then they'd look 12 months later, or maybe 2 years later. They didn't normally do any more follow-up than that. But there was a really good paper, which if you can get online, by Michael Biggs, which a British professor of sociology, and he went back to all the Dutch protocol work, all the original science that justified puberty blockers. And he discovered that the follow-up questions were so absurd that they were designed to make them feel to make it look like a success. And so one of the questions was to trans boys, i.e., basically to girls. They would ask them before they took the puberty blockers how gender dysphoric they were about their female genitals or their breasts, and then they would give them the puberty blockers, and then they would come back and they would say, how gender dysphoric are you about your breasts? But they didn't have breasts anymore.
Right.
They didn't feel they were female. So you were asking the question in such a way that you were bound to get a positive answer. These kids were now being told that they were male, and you were asking them about their female genitals. Well, they don't think they're female anymore. So it was that sort of strangely biased questioning that Biggs explores in his paper. It's really a brilliant paper. I mean, at the end of the paper, you think, oh my God, these poor kids. I mean, there are definitely really troubled kids who are really screwed up about their bodies and the gender that they are. The question is, it's a bit like a huge hammer to break a nut. There may be other ways to solve this, or there may not be any way to solve it. But this idea that you stop their puberty and then you put them on cross-sex hormones and then you drive them towards surgery, so far there's no real convincing evidence that is the best way to try to solve those problems.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about a little bit was Jazz Jennings.
Yes.
And reality TV star, I guess that's how you would describe Jazz. And there's quite a bit that's shocking about Jazz Jennings. One, I can't believe that this show was made. But Jazz seems to be an example of this thing that people say doesn't happened. It's happening. So you hear a lot of people say, well, no, they don't do that on like young kids. They don't put them on, puberty blockers and all that. And then you have an example of this young kid who's went on puberty blockers, underwent, this surgery, and where I don't know, following him or her, for years and years on their life. What do you make of that? Of that show and what's going on?
The problem was that, Barbara Walters, who was a well-known journalist, TV presenter, presented this show in 2007, and she went along, she saw the family, and she didn't ask any question that a normal person would ask of these parents and this kid. So this kid says, oh yeah, I think I'm a girl, but maybe the parents are encouraging her to think this. Her, I'm saying her, he encouraging Jazz to think this. Maybe the culture's encouraging. Maybe there's another reason why Jazz is thinking this, but no, it was just bought wholesale by Barbara Walters. And in fact, at the beginning of the show, Barbara Walters starts by saying something like, gender dominates our lives. Girls like dresses and pink, boys like blue and trucks. And you're like, well, okay, well, if that's how you're gonna define boys and girls, then you're gonna find some boys and girls that don't fit that. There are boys, not necessarily ones that grow up to be gay, but any that don't like trucks. And there are boys that don't like playing sport and prefer music, and there are girls that want to climb trees and kick balls. And so it was a really strange way to begin the show. And then in the end, surprise, surprise, the evidence that Jazz is a girl is all about the fact that his bedroom is full of frilly things, presumably chosen by him, but maybe chosen by his mum. And he likes dolls and he likes long hair. He doesn't, so a lot is made about the fact that he likes long hair.
Right.
But I mean, how does that prove that this is not a boy? I mean, there's nothing, boys have long hair in different cultures and short hair in others, and in some cultures guys have beards and other ones they don't. I mean, it's just like this is ludicrous to take a cultural norm and say that defines whether this child is a boy or a girl. I mean, I found a very interesting little snippet of a video actually presented by Jazz. There was an exhibition at the Smithsonian that was celebrating girlhood. And for some reason, of course, they thought that it would be a really good idea to have Jennings, who's a boy, a male, celebrate girlhood. But in that video made by the Smithsonian, there's a little snippet of Jazz when he was 7, I think, maybe 6 or 7. And there he introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Jaron," which is Jazz's original name, Jaron. And then starts talking, and then he looks up and he's obviously being corrected and says, "You can call me Jazz." But the point is, this is 2 years after his parents said that he transitioned socially, and then he was really, really upset if you referred to him as he or used his own name.
And there he is using it.
And there he is happily using his own name, but then you see him look up, and I think it's really revealing that there. I think maybe the boy was, all over the place and thought he was a girl. But most parents would either just go along with it for a little while and just slowly but surely talk him out of it, see where it went. But no, Jeanette Jennings went straight to the diagnostic sort of manual of mental health, DSM, and she's on the record. She said, "I diagnosed him myself, and then I went to find people who would confirm the diagnosis." This is an ordinary mum from South Florida. How did she get to diagnose her kid and come up with the belief that he is she?
Wow. Last night I was a guest on a podcast called The Bathhouse with Danny Polishchuk, and he brings together like a bunch of comedians. It's like a call-in show. And before we were hanging out in the green room, which is actually where it's recorded. It's in the green room of the Stand, the comedy club in New York. And beforehand, I forget how it came up. I think we were talking. Someone brought up Sean Connery, and which I believe your countryman, Sean Connery,
big hero over here.
Yeah, and I asked the guy, "Oh, have you ever seen the interview he did with Barbara Walters?" Where Barbara Walters asks him about slapping women, and anybody, you could find the clip on YouTube, and it's worth watching on its own. It's sort of
quite shocking.
Yeah, it's quite shocking, a relic of its time. But you bring up Barbara Walters, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, she pushed back so hard against Connery for if a woman needs a slap, I'll give it to her.
Yeah.
But yet. With this child,
Barbara Walters managed to get an interview with Gaddafi. And one of her questions, surrounded by his people, was, Mr. Gaddafi, why does everyone think you're mad? Which is like brilliant. And yet she goes to the South Florida house and she just buys into all this kooky nonsense.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, you almost wonder like what maybe it was an age thing. Maybe she was a little, into her, her later years. I don't know, but it's
maybe it was at the moment where, I mean, you know what it's like, the media, and I'm not criticizing the mainstream media or whatever. The media is a hungry beast and it needs something new, and a reason, you must watch 2020 tonight. We have got something new. And so it's this beast that wants to come up with the latest thing. And so maybe, it would have undermined the latest thing if Barbara Walters had gone in there and actually showed that this kid was being misled, or that this kid was just confused, or that maybe this kid would just grow out of it. But instead, she went along with, in 2020, to their shame, went along with this notion, and they allowed the mother. The mother said, I think Barbara Walters, one question that was at all probing was, some people will think, that you're harming your child or whatever. And Jeanette Jennings said, better to have, what was it, that famous phrase, better to have a living daughter than a dead son. You think, well, if that's, you could justify anything then, if you say, I don't do this, my child is going to die. The fact is, suicide in children is minuscule. I mean, absolutely minuscule. The idea that hundreds of children are committing suicide because you don't let them put a dress on is just a complete load of BS. It's just ridiculous. But it was accepted that somehow, Jeanette Jennings was saving Jazz's life by putting him on this sort of medical pathway.
Yeah, I have two kids, and I'm
how old are they?
Oldest is 3, and then the youngest is going to be 2. And what's funny is one day the oldest, just out of the blue, we'd been watching the Smurfs, the cartoon series, and rapid fire, one after the other, my son said, I'm baby daddy, I am baby Gargamel, and I'm a baby girl. And like one after the other. And I was, and in my, with the subject matter and in the zeitgeist, I was just thinking like, oh, I hope he chooses a cheaper version. Choose the cheaper one. Baby girl, that's going to cost us. Baby daddy, that's going to cost us. Be Gargamel from from the Smurfs. But
I'm not. So many friends, the reason I was asking the age was, you say to them, how old are they? And they say 12, 13, 14. And you think, oh God.
Yeah.
Because, it's a wave going through schools and everywhere else, and you've got parents who are just like, oh great, it's okay. She's just non-binary, and who cares if they can call themselves whatever they want, as long as it's not something that suggests that they might want to do anything medical, then people are relieved.
Yeah, and I wonder too, a brother of mine knows somebody whose kid, I guess, early on, that they started identifying as the opposite sex, and the parents went along with it. Could be that the mom is kind of into it, and
not that uncommon.
Yeah, and my brother and I, we checked in, not too long ago, and I had asked like, oh, how's that going? Because it's been like a few years.
Yeah.
And he was telling me that, he feels they haven't talked in a while. And it might be like better off because the awkwardness of, were he to ask how things are going and say, oh yeah, they're on, this hormone or that hormone.
Yeah.
So it's like the line of, what constitutes abuse. Because if like, for example, if I knew that somebody was molesting their child or doing something like that, I mean, it would be a no-brainer of how you handle that. It's, you call the authorities, or, worst case, you step up and, to protect this child. And now you have this other element that looks a lot like abuse, looks a lot like harm, but yet it's sort of it's okay,
Yeah. Well, I mean, because the thing is, if there wasn't this whole movement and this whole sort of culture which validates it, if somebody just told you, yeah, I've decided to give my child this really powerful drug, which will, really change their body and, and will affect their development, you'd think, what fucking nutcase is doing this? And you would, but you can't, because this is a whole culture that is encouraging, validating, and the vast majority of these parents think they are doing the right thing. So it makes it much more difficult. There are, though, I think it's called, I think the joke name is Transhausen by proxy. So, like a riff on Munchausen. There are a surprising number of parents who really buy into this, who seem delighted that they've got such an interesting child, one that is transgender. I'll be able to talk about that with the other parents. And you think, honestly, just have a boring child,
right?
Not boring, but not one that has some. It's the same way, when there were loads of kids who had ADHD. Oh, there's still now that kids have either got ADHD, they're on the spectrum, they've got dyslexia, dyspraxia. I mean, no kid is allowed to have, to have no medical condition, because that would make them just normal. And everybody, so many of these parents want to be able to, and it's that sort of, savior mentality where I'm doing so much to help my child because of its dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, and all the rest of it. When surely loads of kids had all of these things, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and people just go on with it.
Yeah.
We didn't have, and I don't know if in America there's maybe more money to be made out of this. I mean, doctors diagnosing and pharmaceutical products to be bought for these kids that, shy. We just used to call kids shy.
Right. Well, shit, I wish my kids were shy. I got two animals who they do not stop moving. The younger one is like, he's a bad mofo. He loves to wrestle and fight and all that. So, in our situation where I'm like, I could understand where I'm like, is there any way I could just make them sleep and make them just quiet down, calm down? So I wonder too, like, if there's an element of that, like people, like parents who see normal child behavior and they're wild and they need to expend energy, and it's an annoyance to the parent, and they're like, how can we handle this? Let's diagnose, our child with something and then give them a pill that's going to slow him down for our needs, which is, a pretty scary thing. One thing I wanted to bring up, because I had found you on Twitter, and everybody should check out your stuff. Twister Film, right? Twister Film, and you had like these really interesting threads on interesting subject matter, and it's the kind of stuff where people will shower you with not much love, but more hate. And something that I found recently is like, the worst thing that you could do on Twitter is to defend J.K. Rowling. And I did that the one day. And what I noticed was there was, basically my stance is like, no, J.K. Rowling isn't transphobic, and kind of get over it. And what I found really interesting is that the amount of hate from either trans people or trans allies that was directed at me. And one of the things that they pointed out is they said how big my forehead was, and that I was balding, like my receding hairline. And what's so funny is, like, out of all the things that I'm like most sensitive about, it's not my receding hairline at all. So I quite often people say, and you're bald. And I'm like, and your point is, I mean, who cares? Like, I don't give a shit. And what I found just so interesting is, like, here I am being my physical appearance is a target by people who have like actual body dysmorphia or gender dysmorphia. Like people who literally hate them, like the body that they're in, are coming at me making fun of my hairline. And I was like, oh my God, it's so I've had fun in that way. So,
but I do think, it's fun. I mean, it's funny how things come back in different forms, like, the misogyny that somebody like J.K. Rowling gets. This is supposed to be a movement, that calls itself progressive. And they say things that no, old-fashioned, pub brawling, thug misogynist would say from 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, that's right. I don't even know where they dream it up. I mean, it's so visceral, like, I wouldn't say all the stuff, but it's all about sucking dicks and fucking you over and all that. And you think, well, that is really revealing. That this movement that thinks it's progressive and and saintly has a lot of strange forces that have sort of been diverted into it.
A lot of female dick energy. That somehow.
Well, I think they call it lady dick, don't they?
Lady dick. Excuse me. Tip your hat to.
Yeah, I think it's just the old type of dick with a bit of lipstick on.
Yeah. Oh my God. So how has been working in the documentary genre for you been? Like, do you have any projects in the works or?
Well, I am doing a documentary about puberty blockers, which is good. Great. Can't see who it's for, and that's good. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of work. Something's, you can tell the culture is changing. At the moment, it's quite tribal, but 2 or 3 years ago, it wasn't even tribal. It was just one voice and a few people trying desperately, like J.K. Rowling, to push against it. Over here, it's a big shift. I think now the research is being done. I think there's going to be a real hunger to work out where did all this come from, what motivated it, what the science is and isn't. And so I think there'll be quite a lot of shows being made. Barbara Walters is unfortunately not any longer around. It would have been great to get Barbara Walters to go back and ask the questions that she should have asked. But hey ho.
Yeah. And and is there anything in particular that you think like everyone should check out? Either on this subject or science in general. Like, did you?
I mean, there's some really good books. I mean, I think Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage is a fantastic book. Helen Joyce's book, she's a British writer. It's called Trans. Really, really good. It sketches some of this out, but also talks about women in sport, and it's. I mean, I think the biggest threat from all of this movement has been to women, and therefore, I think it's almost exclusively women who are writing the books because they really get it. Kathleen Stock has written a really good book. The name will come back to me. Material Girls, and that's really good because she's a philosopher and she really examines the way in which because it's so much of this sort of enforcement is done by language. We have to use the pronouns, but she does this brilliant bit where she goes to different universities in England where they've all bought into the different gender identities, like demisexual and aromantic. But the thing about this movement is it doesn't even. It's never even coherent or consistent. So she looks at the different definitions used by the different universities. Like demigender is where you can sort of you one of your genders is fixed, but the other one isn't, and it moves around.
Yeah, what the fuck is that?
So she has great fun looking at these different definitions and how they contradict each other. Yeah. So I think those three spring to mind. Afterwards, I'll think, damn, I should have remembered that other one. But those are great introductions.
Yeah, earlier this year, I was at a conference called FreedomFest. It was in Memphis, Tennessee. Next year is going to be in Las Vegas, and I was on a panel And one of the women on the panel is a Black American lesbian who's very much, I guess you would call it gender critical, about, this stuff. And it was so much fun getting to talk to her, on the panel and say, like, oh, don't you know, like, the new thing that you need to accept as a woman is the term bonus hole. Like, don't you know that you as a woman need to accept that bonus hole? Like, for me, it bonus hole means like it's something like a douchey guy would say to refer to a woman's asshole, and it's like, but now this is a term of respect that this woman who's in a relationship with another woman for her whole life, she's been a lesbian, they have like a kid and all that. You have to bow down and accept this crass, disgusting. So it's amazing on the language on the language side for sure. Cool. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining.
A pleasure.
Me today. And just so everybody, you can check out Malcolm's Substack, Malcolm Richard Clark, and then check him out on Twitter, Twister Film. All right.
Lovely to talk.